I'm Carl Beatty. I'm Chief of Staff of Berklee College of Music. I've been in this position about 3 years. Prior to that, I taught music production and engineering. My background is as a freelance recording engineer in New York City, where I worked for about 18, 20 years before I came to Boston. I have not taught production. I'm a dinosaur. I'm a rare breed, a recording engineer. I like recording engineering. That was my chosen field. I did a little bit of production, but my comfort zone is engineering. You know, it changes daily. And today I think the advice would be that they should find a real engineer and watch them work and be in the room with them and experience what that's like, because that is the one component that's missing in terms of the understanding of what an engineer does and brings to a session. We're in a magazine culture where people can think that they can learn what they need to out of a magazine. If they get the right pieces, then they can do that, but that's not what engineering is. Engineering is facilitating a process and making what can be a highly technical atmosphere go away because there's creative things happening. Discretion and knowing when to speak. Attention to detail, a good set of ears, because we see it over and over again here. We get lots of visiting artists. We had Elliot Shiner and Al Schmidt last week. We've got George Massenberg here this week. And there are lots of questions about what mic did you use, where did you put it, and all that stuff. And the kids watch these masters work, but they don't understand how it sounds the way that it sounds. So there's a point where you can boil it down to science, and then you really got to listen. So you could, I think with these, what good engineers prove over and over again is that no matter what the tools are, they get quality results. And that's because it's down to understanding that everything that they do is interpreted by an ear. You got to see a real engineer in action, or more than one, because there are different ways of doing this that are sensitive and effective across the board. So I learned in an environment where there were 4 or 5 engineers in the staff engineer era, and in that situation you get to pick and choose. You can take, you know, the facility for equipment from one guy, the diplomacy from another person, the sense of balance from another one, the physical setup of where the room is done. I hate that saying. I never believed that saying. I never said it to anybody. I would discourage people from saying it. I just, as an assistant, I would be on too many mixes where you just couldn't. So, and I never understood that. So I don't hear people say it a lot now, and I wonder why that is. I think it's because they're not really thinking about the mix. They're thinking about adding more stuff. Engineering is now data collection. So, so this idea of fix it and mix, I never internalized. I just don't. I think that you need to listen as you go. I think you need to take a shot. You know, if in the land of 150 tracks, if 1 or 2 of them aren't what you wanted, well, nobody's going to hear it. But more importantly, you'll have to deal with it so that next time you know what you need to do. So that idea of making decisions, not making decisions, is so misplaced. You've really got to take a shot. You know, as somebody said to me once, you know, it's a 4-minute piece of music. We're not doctors. Nobody's going to die. Make a decision. So fix it in the mix is not something that I believe, I champion, or suggest. All the things that I see that have changed drastically because of Pro Tools, the biggest one is communication. For the performers on the other side of the glass, as it were, and in many cases now, because of home recording, the virtual glass, there's very little feedback from the producers. There's very little guidance in terms of performance because they know they have acres and acres of real estate to collect data, and very often the guidance is do another one. And from the world I come from, of limited real estate, 24-track analog recording, that wasn't really part of the process. You had to be listening and making decisions as you go, and if there's anything that's happening now, that's not happening. All the decisions are being held into the mix session, and that's not a good environment for good mixes. Having unlimited tracks, My personal opinion is that it's a bad thing, and that's coming from the standpoint of an educator, and also as an engineer. But my more pragmatic answer is that it's just different. You know, the style of production is different, and people are responding to it, and there are good records being made. I think that it's hard to learn something without limitations, and when there are no limitations, people aren't encouraged to make decisions. So, you know, if you make a decision, then you have to deal with the consequences of the decision. If you never make any, you're usually finding that stuff out in the mix, or you're dealing with a multitude of people not making decisions. So the producer's not making decisions, the engineer hasn't made any decisions, and then when you get to the mix, you're not mixing, you're making decisions. And the old paradigm was that lots of decisions were being made as you approached the mark. So I don't think unlimited tracks are necessarily a good thing. I think it takes a certain amount of discipline to understand what that is. But if you have new users coming to the fore, they don't have a context. Anybody that's done any kind of recording prior to doing that has some context to work with it. I don't want to do it that way. I only want to keep 5 of those. Simple things like that. But for the average new user, they're not coming to it with that. They're coming to eyes wide open and willing to explore and go down many, many paths. And I don't necessarily see that as a good part of the process. It makes the whole process in some way a little bit less compelling. I don't think you can all of a sudden make the decisions, but I think that the users are convinced that with the power of the system, they can do it. I think that there's a subtle shift in the way that recordings are done because of the power of these systems. Every recording they make is viewed in some way as a flaw that needs to be corrected. So why listen? I mean, listen, there's nothing happening in real time now. If you're talking digital, well, it takes a certain amount of time just to process that signal. We're all dealing with latency. We see video feeds that are delayed relative to the figure we're seeing on stage. So as we get into the digital domain, everything is just being offset. Everything is delayed. People, you know, again, they're setting up a recording and then having a conversation with the people in the control room and not really listening because they're going to listen later. Or somebody is willing to take hours of their life and deal with all these multitude of choices that haven't been made. So I think that the context is really important, and I think that just like you and I, when we learn, as we struggle with analog, it takes lots of time of going to the well to get some sort of understanding of that. I think that what's not embedded in the workstation and digital technology is this understanding or this willingness to streamline the approach and find faster and more efficient ways. The fact that people aren't spending a lot of money for studio time means that everybody's very lackadaisical about the kind of time they're spending. The fact that there's a prevalence of home studios means that it's kind of seeped into the consciousness from the musician side of things that things can take as long as they want. So when I say things are less compelling, that's what I mean, is that there's no real agenda to try and get this done faster and really capture a musical idea and elicit a performance, which is what people respond to emotionally. There's this misplaced thought that you can create a performance through the power of the system. Again, for people that have context, they're brutal. They make decisions, they set up shortcuts. They know going in that they're only going to take, 2 or 5 of something. And when it gets to the 6th one, they're going to make a decision or they're going to name it. Very much paradigms that have existed since analog. Which, like, if you're going to, and what I learned in analog was when the red light goes on, write it down, but not until the red light goes on. You don't write down intent, you write down what's there. So that issue of documentation and commitment doesn't really exist now. I think the lack of decision making ends up making people spend a lot more time on this stuff. I mean, months. There's this tremendous amount of time that's spent, quote unquote, offline. Either it's an assistant that's doing it or somebody that's doing it that's off the quote unquote the grid in terms of the actual recording. And I did a lot of work in Pro Tools prior to my deciding I didn't want to. And what I was finding, stylistically or methodologically, the way that people work, is because you can just open up the file and there's the balance, there's very little exploration of the balance. And that was part of the aspect of working in analog that was intriguing and a point of discovery, is that you had to build that balance each time. And sometimes there would be something that happened that was kind of cool. Maybe, oh, that's cool, the bass drum works that loud. But also you'd know what was there. So what I would find is that you'd open up a file, and from a production and arranging point, because things never changed, people would be adding things to the production based on what they were hearing, that balance. So I'd come in to mix something, and people would be hearing parts, and what is that? It sounds like a monkey playing the solo. That's a direct quote. So I don't know, this is your, you know. So there are things that people never hear because they're making judgments on a fixed balance that's good enough for now, but not anything approaching what the mix is going to be, because they can't know that because they have so many elements they're keeping that, you know, it's all fluid. So it's a very different concept. So on the one hand, it could be fast. Somebody could be very happy with that balance, come up, but work on it for an incredibly long time. So I don't know at the point, I think there's a point where fast comes in, but I don't know where that point comes in. I think, again, it comes down to context, somebody knowing when they got what is right, when they have something they know is the definitive version of what they want. And again, I think that comes from experience and knowing which path you want to go down as you power on. I think there are exceptions, just like a Prince or a Marvin Gaye, and somebody that has that kind of vision of where they're headed when they start. I think that there are people that have the ability to be decisive and committed to the idea that they have, meaning that embedded within these systems, there are lots of ways to be diverted. We experience it on common surfing. You're doing on the internet, you do something and some flag comes up and says you want to update this program, and suddenly you go off to the side. So I think that I think it's exceptional, but I think it's possible. Again, you know, trying to be pragmatic, we see it. You know, if I cleave too closely to what I know, what my favorite things are, it doesn't recognize the fact this is a changing world. You know, when 8mm cameras came out, everybody was a filmmaker. So we're really in this place with audio now. So there are some people that can do that. It kind of bumps up against the recommendation that I always give when somebody comes to me, and typically a musician, for a recommendation of what to buy. I know the tendency is to, in the face of a salesman, to buy potential. And that potential usually means a manual about this thick and lots of technical stuff to wade through. That what I recommend to artists is that you got to figure out what you want to do. I mean, do you want to be an engineer? Or how deeply do you want to dive into manuals? What do you really need out of the system? And try to work from that side of things, because it's really easy to get diverted from it. So I think that there are people that consider that. I think there are people that dive in and do it themselves, and by the nature of the way they work, again, because they have some sort of context, they are trying to keep as straight a path as possible and creatively stay on the path they're on. So doing it all themselves is possible. But we got tons of examples where one person doing everything sounds like one person doing everything. So I think that it's, you know, just like the aspect of engineering being an evaluated thing, I think that there are some people that can do it that no matter what the tools they had would be successful, and there's others that try based on the success of exceptions. I think there's always going to be a situation where the producer and the artist have a level of communication that doesn't allow for a third person in the room, as it were. And I think that there are good producers who can divide their minds and get the job done. Certainly in Nashville, you've got a raft of them. And again, I think that comes down to the sensitivity of the producer and the engineer. Long-standing relationships between engineers and producers produce a certain kind of radar that becomes embedded in the process, and that's kind of the ideal in establishing a relationship with a producer and engineer, is that there's trust between those two, and that combined trust equals a certain amount of trust for the artist. And a situation with it's a freelance situation, that understanding has to be created between an artist and a producer and an engineer. Very often will lead to the engineer being out of the room, because again, the relationship is with the producer and the artist. So I think it's, you know, it's a mixed bag. MP3s are a difference in quality. Does it bother me? Yeah, it bothers me to my core. Do I know how narrow that is? Yes. Do I remember how prevalent cassettes were and how people put up with those? Yeah. So, the MP3 is the equivalent of a cassette. It's long been known that people are very happy with the copy and not necessarily tied into the quality. So it is mobility, and more than anything, it's how many numbers can we store? It's just there's a real limit to how big the data can be in terms of quality. So we're always going to have that battle now in the digital age. So I think the issue of quality is really a little squirrely. I was just having a conversation this morning with someone about a band recently put a release out and essentially made it a la carte, pay what you want. And it's now coming out that the free version, quote unquote free version, has a lesser quality, and now people are reacting to that, which I see as a pretty positive sign, because there hasn't been any indication before now that people were concerned about quality. So I see that as pretty positive. I would think that people who are dealing with surround and wanting to deliver files in 96K bit depth sampling rate are encouraged by that. But I think it's always going to be a small part of the market. It's like the audiophile segment of the market. My mentor was a guy named Michael Brower. I was his first assistant, and I teach what I learned from him. Was a lot of my teaching here, and much of it was built around speed. It's like working fast, which codifies your knowledge. It also makes you attractive, and it makes it seem like you're working really hard, which you are. But it also enables you to control the pace of the session. If you learn to work slow and stay there, there's no way you're ever going to work fast and not make a ton of mistakes. If you learn how to work fast, we can work slow. You can also work really fast and be efficient, because it's always that last 10 minutes of the session where you kill yourself if you don't know how to work that quickly. So as a personal icon, Michael Brower taught me a lot. And then in terms of engineers that I like, I mean, there's just a whole raft of them. I've been very fortunate to be here at Berklee and meet some of these people as they've come through over the years, and also gain appreciation. But I guess kind of chronologically, well, I can't go chronologically, but the ones that come to mind are Steve Hodge, Al Schmidt, Bob Claremountain, of course, Frank Filippetti, Elliot Shiner, Chuck Ainlay. I mean, these are names that we hear over and over again. There's a guy named Spike Stent out of England whose work I like, Hugh Padgham, and I'm leaving a bunch out. They have a great sense of balance. So it's where you go from there. So to be able to set up in a relatively shorthand, somebody who I didn't mention, a guy named Michael DeLug, who did Barry Manilow, and he works on the David Letterman show. I was always impressed with he could grab 10 faders and bring them up into balance. And being able to do that is a real challenge, is a real feat. And so I think that for somebody that can do that, you're one step away from raising the bar, as it were. We have a whole category of engineers who have never seen the other side of that, which is where do you go from there, now that you got the balance. And I think the audiences, they're not that critical. They're reacting to something emotionally. So there's a subtlety in there to me. What we're seeing now in the new breed of engineer, on the one hand, is good. On the other hand, it's a different aesthetic than the environment I learned in. And the environment I learned in was you learn how to make balances. You learn how to have good balances, and you go from there. So I think what we have now prevalently are balance engineers, is that we have people who can make pretty decent balances, but they're not particularly dynamic. And I think there are a multitude of reasons for that. It makes them easy to edit, but also it's a different kind of consciousness of what a mix is. And what I learned about mixing is that it's a fairly active process, active listening, and in some cases active movement. Depends on the style. It's a loss, and it's the way it is. It's the way it is now. I think that I think it's too soon to say that it's a loss. I mean, recent events in New York City, for instance, there's a major studio that closed, and And that has resulted in the handful that are still standing that have real estate, and meaning rooms to record in, are now pretty busy. And anecdotally, I'm hearing that the handful of studios in any given metropolitan area that remain are doing pretty well. So I don't think that it's completely lost. I think it's moving to this place where somebody's going to realize there's a body of knowledge that's being jeopardized and it's just going to go away. And in a lot of places it is going away. So I'm not ready to say that it's lost. I think it's always going to live somewhere, because ultimately at the end of the day, anybody wants somebody to bring them a cup of coffee and not be in their own house and have that experience. And to be relieved of all that stuff. So even though it's a new style of working, it has all these benefits of being fluid, and the artist can do what they want. At some point, they got to get out of their own way and let somebody serve them and be creatively unleashed in that way. I think that there's always going to be that kind of aura around it. Whether we have I think what's going to get lost is the technical maintenance expertise. I don't think the kind of sensibility around performance and dialogue is going to get lost, but I think that measure of people who really know how to fix, and not just fix, but how to be innovative and create new products, new pieces of hardware to solve things. I think that body of knowledge is going to go away, and we'll probably have to look around for that pretty hard. That's one of the reasons that I stepped away from teaching. I just began to feel like my points of relevance were getting further out with my students. And I think that engineering is a evaluated approach. It's like, and I've experienced that firsthand. I paid my dues, became a fairly successful recording engineer, watched the onset of home recording and cheaper and more cost-effective systems and quality recordings come up, and the commensurate lack of willingness of people to pay you what your time is worth. From my first-hand experience, trying to convince somebody what you're worth after they've seen you work and after you work with them is a lot easier, because the kind of light goes on. It's like what the value of having somebody there who's pretty objective, moves fast, is sensitive to the artist, sensitive to the producer, and basically takes a whole body of decision-making off the plate of the producer and the artist, is something that has an unknown quantity for somebody. It's not until they experience it that you can actually have the conversation of, well, that's why my time is worth, that's why I'm an engineer, and that's why I charge you this much. It gets harder and harder to have that decision, have that conversation. So that's why I stopped working. We don't have musical leaders at the record companies. We have lawyers and bottom line people. So their opinions are guided by the success of something that preceded the thing they're working on. So they hire that person, and so it's more to do with other things, not quality. It's got to do with projected impact in some way. Here at Berklee, we have an unusual program in that we have never been about the tools. We've been about decision-making and collaboration. The way the classes work is they're production classes, they're engineering classes. The producer has to hire an engineer, they collaborate. And when that stuff happens in a dorm room, now they have laptops, it's a given that the producer will be doing stuff on their own, but we heavily encourage them to use the engineer throughout the process. Even if they're not engineering, they should be there and be part of that process. We've also, up until, this is 2007, this is September 2007, so up until, January of 2007, we were running analog at this college. And it had nothing to do with sound. It had to do with the fact you got to make decisions. With Pro Tools, it's really hard to do that. We have a project that's called a sound-alike that students would have to, from a library of songs, choose one and get it to sound alike on 8 tracks. There's a reason that we want them to do that. So we would have students who would go off and go into Pro Tools, do it in Pro Tools, and then bounce it down to 8 tracks, analog, by the way, 8 tracks analog. So on the one hand, it's great that they're inventive and kind of do that, but on the other hand, they're completely missing the point. They're not embracing the reasoning that we have for doing that. So I think it's really challenging to do in Pro Tools because in my experience, what I see with students is they will always go to their comfortable place. In trying to teach them analog, which is spread out and requires you know where the knob is, and there's no pull-down window to kind of find your way. You are responsible for a certain amount of knowledge, and they back away from that. So it's hard. I think it's hard to teach that kind of stuff with Pro Tools. By the same token, in live performance, another thing I see here is that we see students show up. There's a pretty seamless transition between the way they appear on the street and the way they appear on the stage, and I think that we need to encourage a different aspect. It's a different place. It's a different creative place. They're doing something different than just walking around in the air. So we want them to value their artistry in that way. And it's a similar paradigm in terms of the studio. I'm not a scientist. I started out as an audiophile. It's one of those people that thinks that wires sound different and all the weirdness that comes along with audiophilia. So I can only speak from my own experience, and I think that digital sounds great in a controlled environment. I've heard some pretty amazing digital projects, but they typically have emanated from facilities that have a very tight infrastructure. It's very controlled, all the jitter, all the clocking, all the stuff is right, all the sample rates are great, they do it all the time. There's a lot of care around that loop of conversion and on both ends. So those things aren't great. The average ones can be littered with artifacts and not very involving. So from my side of things, I just find that in general, it's the only way that I could describe it is that it's just less involving. There's just something less compelling about it. When I learned how to mix, there are 3 places. There's a definitive middle, a left, and a right. And for the average digital material that I listen to, the middle is really odd. It's not anything that is familiar to me. I hear it and I understand it, but it doesn't feel as solid or significant as analog does to me. And also it's not as wide. So if you broadly assume that what digital doesn't do well with is low-level signals, in terms of ambience and all the things that make a reverb kind of incoherent and out of phase, that's all low-level detail. So if digital is not handling that or doesn't know how to handle that stuff, then you can hear it in analog. What tends to happen is that the reverb becomes much more localized between the speakers and there's less of this stuff going on. So, on a personal level, I listen to digital, it's just there's something about it just is not quite as involving. That notwithstanding, I have my favorite recordings that I listen to on CDs and, don't know whether they're analog transfers or digital or whatever, but I'm always seeking those things that seem to appeal on a visceral sense to me, and turn those things in terms of depth and placement and stuff like that. I do listen to an iPod through headphones. I don't plug it into my stereo. That would be totally frustrating. I think an iPod is great. I'd rather be listening to an iPod than a cassette. I think that just like as an engineer and a mixer, you're trying to make your product sound good on a range of speakers. I think the challenge with the format is to understand the format and try to get it to sound good in that format. So what I would like to have is kind of an encode decode on an iPod or AAC or whatever the coding is, so that you can hear what it's like. I mean, to me, it's the same paradigm that existed years ago when you do something and it come out on vinyl. It's like, you know, there's this distance of time between what you did in the studio and the product, and you had no idea what it was going to sound like, and you had to kind of remember, you know, 6 months ago what you did so you wouldn't do that again or make the modification. I think we're in the same place because there's no way to hear how ultimately this stuff is going to wind up. I think it's personal. You know, I used to say to my students, people don't care what it sounds like. The average audience doesn't care what it sounds like. It's been proven. Pick any record that you think is horrible that was a hit. Well, you know it because it was hit, and his sound had nothing to do with it. People are making an emotional connection with it. And I also tell engineering students, it's like, you know, it's not your record. You know, something's distorted. You got a problem with something, but everybody says it's okay, well, then it's okay. You got to move on. So you got to pick your battle. So if the artists are listening to that, they want some sort of qualified understanding what it's going to be like. Ultimately, I don't think it matters. The audience doesn't care. But in terms of the artist, the engineer, and the producer having that, you know, area of confidence about the work they've produced, sure, I think that it's perfectly valid. You want to know. Early on in my career as an engineer, when I was just starting, I'd get a new recording and I'd go home and I'd sit down in my, you know, highly tweaked system and sit in the middle and listen to it and analyze it and figure out, you know, what it was doing and what I liked and what I didn't like. But I caught myself and realized that I was getting to a point where I wasn't liking music. It was listening to all the other stuff. So what I began to do then was purposely put something on in another room and listen that way. It's something I learned, and I again would tell my students, so you never lose sight of your audience. Never lose sight of your audience. Those are the people that are going to determine whether it's successful or not. So when I say that, I say when I go to the studio and I have referencing, there's some things that I listen to for placement. There's some things that I listen to for frequency response. And there's some things that I just listen to because I like the way they make me feel. And as I move around the control room, my listening is between the speakers, but it's also everywhere that I'm working in that room, because that's the way that I work. You're over by the rack adjusting an EQ on something, well, you're listening to the whole thing in some sort of context. So, you know, so it's about, you know, getting all those marks about how wide it is, where the center is, what the vocal sounds like, and being familiar and very detailed about that. But then there's about how does this feel in here? Because ultimately that's how you're measuring what you're doing. So for kind of feel and sonic properties, I really like Miles Davis' Tutu record, which I think was mixed by a guy named Eric Calvi. For this, and for sheer feel and kind of very dense mix that sounds different on just about every speaker you listen to. There's a group called Rise, Robots Rise. I don't even know if it's available anymore, but I know for a fact it was mixed on NS10s, and it's just a very intriguing CD to me because it does literally sound, you hear different things on different speaker systems, but it feels great. There's a CD that I did. I mean, what I tend to do is I listen to other people's work a lot, and this is in terms of me referencing in the studio, and then I might listen to one or two things that I've done because I know them and I know what I did. But it's pretty demoralizing to hear, you know, something that sounds so great and then listen to something you did. It's like, you know. So I try not to juxtapose them too much. I basically, you know, I go from the feel good, sounds okay to something I did, so I don't have to listen next to Bob Clearmountain or Al Schmidt. So the Rise Robot Rise in that category. The one that I did is a CD by a guy named Martin Sexton. It's called Black Sheep, and it was done really quickly, and it sounds really good. It's some of the best work ever I did, and I know intimately what is there. So that's really for the critical placement, depth, sonic quality, all that stuff. Recently I've been listening to Paul Anka's record by Al Schmidt that came out last year, which I think is an amazing recording. uh, there's a Chic record that I like, Chicism. I think it was done by James Farber, and the opening track on that, called Your Love, is just fantastic for low end and basic feel and impact. Al Schmidt I already mentioned, but what I listen to him for is depth in terms of soundstage. It's like, is it, all that incoherence, am I hearing it out of the speaker system? It's not strange at all to me. It falls in the line with cassettes, with growing up in a house with, your parents had one speaker in one room and one in the other, if you're getting a car and there's one speaker in the kick panel that's working, which again is why you listen to stuff on many different speakers. You don't have any, what's out of your hands, you don't have any control over it. So that aspect of listening to an iPod, or for me, it's listening to lots of different speakers, and my favorite speaker is the little speaker that's built in the Studer, 2 tracks. If it sounds good on that, I love that speaker. At one point I was trying to get a couple of them, but I really wanted one. So yeah, I think that's intriguing. And I think you got to take that into account. Stereo. I used to work with, do a lot of work that wound up in England, so very often we would have to check mono compatibility because all the radio stations over there are mono, and the stereo mix would get compromised pretty quickly. But still in all, it had to sound good. And we got tons of mono records out there that sound good. Mono mixing is really hard. But if you can get it to sound good, well, it sounds good no matter what. So for me, there's some areas personally that, as an engineer, that I'm not a musician, audiophile engineer. I like that aspect. So my personal things are listening and trying to get things to sound outside of the speakers. And just like little technical details that aren't really part of the project. So those are my personal agendas. So the fact that people are listening properly, you take into account. The most brilliant take on that was listening to Bob Claremountain, who I think in general has a pretty pragmatic approach about the way he goes about his work, is that he began mixing surround at the same time he's doing stereo, which was unheard of. And somebody asked him where he had his speakers. He goes, oh, well, they're kind of around the control room. It's like they're wherever they are. I mean, there's kind of one over there and one over there. And it sounded pretty cool to me because, yes, there is a standard, but Bob it's like, well, people, they put them wherever they want. So for him to get it to work on that level, I think is admirable. But again, I think it comes to ears. It's like everybody can't do that. So it's unfortunate, but the reality is that we don't have control over how, we can't dictate. I remember albums would come out and they would say, this record is meant to be listened loud late at night. Okay, well, if you can have that, that's nice, but as I used to tell my students, if you mix it loud, all the hype is in the room. So you want it to feel like it's loud. You got to, that's a hard requisite to put on somebody. You got to make sure it works at every level, loud and soft. Figure out how much you want to spend before you start. That's my advice, because it can get out of hand pretty quickly. And it's male dominated, and it's a lot easier for somebody to buy equipment than a pair of underwear. So I would say, figure out your bottom line, because it'll get out of hand really fast. And figure out how much you want to be an engineer and how much you want to get work done. The stuff comes out so quickly that buying potential is sometimes not what you really want. Maybe you need a hammer. Maybe you don't need every feature on the planet. And I think that's where the manufacturers of this stuff fail, is that they make these extremely flexible systems which don't really define how to use them. They say, here you go, do whatever you want. So I would say figure out how much you want to spend and how much time you want to spend when you're facing the manual, because we're in this place where all these engineers are out of work. They've got all these friends who are musicians and created these great relationships, and because of these great relationships, people feel free to call up and say, hey, can you tell me how to, and this is consulting, this is taking money out of people's pockets. And on the one hand, it's as a friend, you're very willing to do that. On the other hand, it's like it's kind of a weird place to be. You got 10 or 15 people calling you several times a day to help them wade through this stuff. Well, either be prepared to pay somebody for that, or on the front end, figure out how much you want to be involved with that kind of nonsense. I think it's up to the person who's building the studio, because the manufacturers aren't going to help you. They're just going to give you as many choices as you want to take on. So you've got to define what you want and use it to death. I mean, there's so much stuff that comes out, and somebody like a Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who's really using every iota out of every box that they've had since since early 1980. I don't know if people are doing that. It's easy to buy new stuff, but how easy is it to really know the tool that you have? Well, you can't teach somebody how to be an assistant engineer. They have to want to be an assistant engineer. And then you can teach them. So, so first of all, you need them to show up. They've got to be inquisitive. They've got to have attention to detail. As far as I'm concerned, they've got to be able to work fast. They've got to be know when to speak. They've got to have a radar that equals the engineers or even exceeds it. They've got to have roving eyes. They've got to be able to look at people's faces and monitor the musicians and the engineer and the producer in terms of their needs, and being able to be discreet when the engineer is unaware of doing something, and be able to let them know that. They've got to be diplomatic. They've got to stay in the room when there's nothing to do. They got to be there and understand that that's the role. The hours, well, sometimes in the old days the hours would be long. I think in general people are working more reasonable hours, but it can oftentimes trip into that. So they've got to have stamina, but also take care of themselves, know when to take care of their ears, and know when to take a break, and know when to say, if the assistant is responsible for in some way I don't want to say the documentation, because there is no documentation anymore, responsible for the kind of the bandwidth and headspace around the session. If it gets beyond them, they've got to know that they got to tell the engineer, well, hold on, I need to take a minute here, and because at some point the engineer is going to turn to that assistant and go, so where is that thing? If they don't know, that's bad. So, and it's a learning process. I think the easy stuff on the front end is the maintenance stuff. It's kind of the setup, tear down, the really bulletproof set of the Pro Tools, get the I/O right, get the mic cables, the patching. All that stuff is, as challenging as it is the easy part. I think the subtleties are the hard one. But I think that one of the reasons that I would compel students to work fast is that it helps them ultimately be able to control the flow of a session, but it also helps them identify their weak areas. It moves the things that they know and do well out of their consciousness, because what I find when they work slow is that they're really thinking about everything they touch. It takes up a lot of headspace. And if really what they want to do is be able to hear, they need to clear their mind. So, so at the point that, that mechanical facility becomes easier, the world opens up, because now they're not thinking about all those little things, and they really can hear, and they really can pay attention to the dialogue and the dynamic of the relationships and the communication, and that's where the assisting really starts to come into fore. But it also becomes a dangerous time, because now they have the technical capability and totally understand the dynamics of what's happening in the control room from the production and engineering and artistic standpoint, and now they're still the assistant standing behind the engineer, so boredom sets in, and that's the killer. So in a case like that, I put out the challenge, learn something new every day. You can learn something new every day, you look for it. You think you know everything, well, you got to look for, what am I going to learn new today? And it keeps your attention span and your observational characteristics up, and it keeps you in the session, because that's really where you want to be, because again, when somebody turns to you and asks you that question, you need to be able to answer. I think they should ask for some material that they've done, and a range of things. And I'm trying to stay on your question, because I'm starting to drift. I think that they should meet with them and have a conversation with them, and try to. It's a relationship. So if they can't get along with that person in some way, or find some common ground, or find some point of trust, then it's a relationship that is not destined to be successful. It's not necessarily going to be unsuccessful, but it may not be successful, because after all, anybody can engineer. But if you want it to leap into that other area, it's going to come down to the relationship that the producer has with the engineer. So, and then of course it's the working situation. So I think that just like engineers are open to getting work but want to get paid, and will very often say, well, let's do the project, I'll do it for this. And then if we decide to work together, then it's going to be this rate. So basically, create a safe place where the producer can evaluate the engineer. I think in the same way, the engineer is evaluating the producer. Because ultimately, you want to have a graceful way of getting out. It's just a business where you meet the same people over and over again. And you got to appreciate that everybody doesn't work well together. But if you burn a bridge, well, that will tend to have more effect on your reputation down the line than if you just understood that it's not a mix that's going to work. So I would say listen a lot. Listen to things. Now, from the engineering standpoint, I've had lots of students ask, well, what if you don't like the sounds, you don't think it sounds good, and how do you ask somebody not to put your name on the record? And those are good questions. One of my colleagues say, well, for the records that he didn't want his name on, he had an alias. But I say, my question, well, who's going to hear it? It's like, if somebody hears it and it's successful, you kind of want your name on it. And the other side is that it's not your career is not defined by this one thing. So when I say listen to work, that work ideally would span across a multitude of things that don't necessarily define this person, but define their capabilities as an engineer. Is that like, I've done this kind of work, I've done this, and are they all going to sound good? Well, maybe, probably not, but it's an example of like, I can handle many different things. And the producer should understand that as they're listening to many different things. It's like the engineer isn't the one who decides what it sounds like. And if you're hiring an engineer and that's what they claim, I don't think you really want them as an engineer, because they're not going to be playing the game. They're going to be too verbal, and they're not an engineer. They're an engineer who wants to be a producer. So figure out what you want, listen to a lot of stuff, and understand that as a producer or as an engineer, you're going to be having your hands on lots of different material, and they don't necessarily define who you are. What Berklee is a college, and we're trying to educate the whole student. So even though we're a quote-unquote art school, what we're seeing in the workplace is that students who go to art schools, in a lot of ways, are being welcomed by many different sectors in the world, because they're well-rounded and have a different way of looking at things. So for parents who are trying to make that decision, the only reason they're asking is because they've identified in their children this strong desire to want to be here. And for students who have decided to come here, they've made the commitment to be here, and they're not concerned about the things their parents are, which are money and how to make a living, typically. And very often they feel like outcasts in their community, and they come here and they're surrounded by 3,999 other students just like them. So as an opportunity for an education, it's a pretty vibrant situation. So, in some way you got to throw back to the parents. It's like, what do you want for your kid? What do you want them to do? We're not promising that they're going to have a job when they get out of here, but what we're promising is that they'll get a well-rounded education and basically pick up enough skills to create what they need. The music industry is changing so much, and there's so many different places for people to land that are not your traditional producer and engineering roles. We're finding that music students, computer programmers like music students in some way. The way that they think and perceive the world and their art lends itself to writing code. Who would have figured that? So we have all these examples, particularly here at Berkeley, of all these our students who have gone on to graduate schools. We've got all the Ivies, we've got schools in Europe, and lots of colleges where our students don't stop, but this becomes a way for them to almost better define what the thing is they want to do.
Thank you for talking.
Sure, you're welcome.